Hi, and thanks for checking out Next Level Carpentry, where I've just finished building this cedar garden trellis / obelisk project. Due to the complexity of building a project like this based on a triangular footprint rather than a rectangular one, I've broken the build process into 3 parts. The first part I'll show is milling the material for the slats and for the legs, and then making a scarf joint fixture for cutting the angle on the top of the legs where they mount to the finial. In part 2 of the video series, I'll show how to make a hexagonal blank for the finial by laminating pieces of 2x6 together. And then in part 3, I'll show the fixtures that I made to cut these steep, sharp compound angles on the X bracing and these horizontal slats. In part 1, I'll show how I milled up the stock for the legs and the slats, and then made a dedicated fixture for cutting the scarf joints where the legs join to the finial. So let's dig into this part of the series. With the complex and intricate design of this triangle trellis, it's important to have straight, flat material to work with in building it. These are great looking 2x4s for the legs, but this one's got a pretty decent bow in it. This has got a twist, so I want to clean that up by flattening it and then truing up the width so that they're nice and straight when I go to assemble the trellis. If the legs are twisted or bowed like they are now, I go to fit the cross braces and the compound miters, and it's going to take a lot of fussing. I'd rather spend the time now to get everything all trued up and save the time later and get a better end result by going through these steps. There's an added benefit of truing up the legs, and that is that by the time I'm done straightening them, they'll be a bit narrower from 3.5 inches down to about 3. And they'll be a bit thinner, probably from 1.5 inches down to 1.25 inches. With a smaller non-stock material size, it lightens up the overall look of the trellis, plus it gives it a more custom look because it's not off the rack sized lumber used to make it. So I begin the process, as always, with a sharp putty knife to clean up the boards, remove any rocks or dirt that got in there at the lumber yard or bringing it to the shop. I'll flatten it on the joiner, true it up in the thickness planer, straighten one edge, rip it on the table saw, and mill all that. So I've got 4 nice smooth surfaces that'll be ready for stain or paint when the trellis is done. A quick scribbled line on both faces of all the boards gives me a visual guide of the planing process to make sure I got the twist and the bow and the cup out of these pieces. Twist is the hardest thing to remove from a board, and this piece being 8 feet long with about a 3/16 inch twist from end to end took some careful positioning and planing to get the twist removed from this side. I think you can see by the taper on this side how much that twist was. It's the opposite on the other end because the piece is basically a very inefficient airplane propeller with a twist like this. So this low corner needs to be removed and this low corner needs to be removed in the planing process, and that leaves this angled profile of the board on both ends. But now the one surface is flat and true, and as I run it through the thickness planer, the squiggle lines will disappear from this corner, which is now a high spot, and this corner, which is a high spot on the opposite end, until the whole piece is flat. And this is the piece I'll call the skinny mini, because all 3 legs will have to be planed down to this thinness to be uniform. As I run the pieces through the planer, I keep an eye on the hash marks on the board. I added a few on skinny mini, the propeller here, so that you can see how the planing process works its way down as it planes the twist that's in this face of the board off of it, because it's indexing on this face of the board, which is now flat and true. I think you can see in the camera that this corner of skinny mini isn't planed while these 2 boards are all cleaned up. Going down to the opposite board, you can see the opposite corner hasn't been planed off yet. That's the back side of the propeller that we're planing out of this piece. A couple more passes and it'll clean up this corner. And when that's done, I'll flip the pieces top for bottom, end for end, and take a whisker off the back to clean them up. Now that Skinny Mini's all cleaned up, I take the pieces and flip them end for end, top for bottom. Let's take the final pass. 1/4 turn on this planer is a 1/64 of an inch. That's enough of a whisker to clean up the back side of these and give it a nice smooth finish that I don't have to sand. And it will end up 1/64 inch less than 1 5/16 inches, which I think will be a nice final thickness. And that snap from a stack of milled boards tells you right away the surfaces are true and parallel. If there's a bow or a twist in those, they don't snap like that. So it's a good thing. And even though the Powermatic PJ882 with that bird Helix helical cutter head in there does a great job of smoothing a board, there's nothing like the 96 cuts per inch that come out of this DeWalt thickness planer for a nice, smooth, finished surface. It's a little word of caution. Make sure the edges of the lumber are cleaned up as well. There's staples in here from the wrap that they put on the bunk of 2x4s at the lumber yard. And you can plane 1,000 feet of board with a nice set of cutter knives or one staple and ruin them either way. And just put a quick line on each edge to keep track of things. Then it's back to the joiner to straighten one edge, over to the table saw to make a parallel edge, and then I'll use the thickness planer as a widthness planer, stand the boards up on edge, and get that nice 96 cuts per inch finish on both edges of the board to finish up the process. For the most part, I think the choice of which edge of the board to plane first on the joiner is a matter of personal preference. Sometimes I put the bowed side down and use the outfeed table to even up the cut to plane the hump off. Sometimes I put the bowed side up and then plane the ears off that curved piece until it's flat and then take a final pass to smooth up the edge. It's a matter of personal preference, and usually it varies from board to board just with the conditions of the board. But bottom line is to end up with one nice straight edge on each of the pieces. And this board now becomes a narrow Nelly because it had the greatest amount of curve to it. So I'll have to make all three pieces this width so that they match up. But that's going to work out fine at 3 inches. I'm using narrow Nelly here to set the width of the rip at 3 1/16 inch. And then I'll take two 1/32 inch passes off on the thickness planer to true up the faces. The cutoffs pretty much tell the story of the straightening process. And this one from narrow Nelly is nothing on each end and a good 1/4 of an inch in the middle. These other ones just have some waviness to them. But they're generally a mirror image of the amount been planed off the other side of the board to straighten it. All right, to finish up the milling process, I'm going to mark the edges of the boards with a reference line. That helps me see in an instant that I've got a complete pass on the whole edge. So to run the final 2 passes on these boards, I'll switch the planer from thickness planing mode to widthness planing mode and run them through, lower the cutter head another 1/32 of an inch and run them through again. They'll end up exactly 3 inches when it's done. And with that final pass, the S4S milling process is complete, and these pieces of cedar will now make trouble-free legs for the triangle trellis. I got you on that one, didn't I? Switching from a thickness planer to a widthness planer using the knife changing wrench. Oh. Before I cut these pieces to their final shape with the angled ends and such, I'll take a handheld router and knock these edges down. So I put Chip to work routing the edges of those pieces with an 1/8" roundover bit. A little Bosch Colt router is just the perfect tool for that sort of thing. You'll do one corner first, flip the board, do the opposing corner on all 3 pieces, flip the whole batch end for end, and then finish up the last 2 corners on each piece in an efficient process of rounding the corners so that they're more durable in the weather, they accept a stain or a finish better, and just add a measure of class to the overall finished product. You go, Chip. Got it, man. What's next? I used the same milling process that I used on the 2x4s on these 1x8s as I cut them into slats that are 2 inches wide and about 11/16 thick by the time I true them up and plane off this rough sawn surface, which is the look I want for this particular trellis. A minor difference is that when I finish up these slats, I'll use a 1/16 of an inch roundover bit instead of the 1/8 of an inch for the same reason, but to switch up the look a little bit and add dimension to the finished piece. I already made and used a scarf joint fixture that I'll show cutting the tops of the legs for the trellis, but I thought I'd just back up and walk through the steps I used to create the scarf cutting fixture that I'll be using in the next sequence. I start out the process with a scrap. This is 3/4 inch material that's big enough for the operation that I need to do, and in this case it's a matter of cutting a 10-degree scarf joint or long miter cut on the tops of the legs. So I take a scrap piece and then snug it up between the saw and the fence so that I know the final cut is going to be exactly on this line. Next, I take a strip of maple that I've made to fit the miter guide slot. It's a nice snug fit. And then I place the sled on top of the strip and mark both ends where the strip lines up with the blank. And I pull those 2 pieces out, and I connected the dots that I just made to show where the strip is going to lay on there. I used a small snappy bit to pilot hole the screws. Like I said, I already pre-made this. I'm just going back through the steps. And a number 7 by 3/4 inch screw works nicely for this application and secures the miter slot bar to the template. And then I used tree wax paste wax to lubricate the miter slot runner so that this assembly fits nicely in the miter gauge slot, runs exactly true to the blade. I want this to be a nice, smooth, snug fit. If there's any resistance, I'll shave this bar down so that it slides smoothly. Usually the wax is enough to do it. If there was any play in this setup, I'd need to make a different piece of stock for the miter gauge slot. Once that's done, I use an accurate protracting ruler to lay out the 10-degree line so that I can index the board for making the cut. Once the line's laid out, I'll take my temporary auxiliary fence and line it up with that line so that it follows the 10-degree angle. Obviously, the same setup works for any angle that can't be achieved with a miter gauge. Then I clamp the fence so that it lines up on those pencil marks. Kind of hard to show in the camera. Once the auxiliary fence is clamped to the sled, I use a snappy bit for a couple quick pilot holes and drive in square drive screws to hold those 2 together. These screw heads are sunken into the surface so they don't scrape on the table and cause resistance and scratch the table. Now that this setup's made, I want to have a nice sturdy handle to put on it. So to make one, I took one of my regular push sticks and planed the heel off of it so I have a nice flat surface to attach to another piece of material that I can screw down to the fixture. Subtract the width of the handle from the board. That's 2 1/8, or 2 1/4, leaves 1 1/8 on either side. Drill a couple pilot holes, centered up between those lines. Stick fast activator. Gorilla glue. All that Gorilla glue is doing is going to hold this in position where I want it while I put in a couple screws from the back side. That way I'm not fussing around trying to keep everything lined up and in position while I put the screws in. Now I'll re-pilot hole through these screw holes. I went a little deep on that one. I'll do another one. Snappy bits are great for that operation. And now I have a rock solid handle to attach to the scarf cutting fixture. And after going through that process of attaching the push stick to a block, I just simply screw the handle plate down to the fixture. And that's all the time that I need to invest in making this simple but accurate sled for cutting these long scarf joints. And I want all viewers to pay attention. Once the blade is raised up high enough to cut through the leg, there's a lot of exposed blade there. I don't have a guard. A guard would get in the way and keep this operation from working. I'm comfortable using this, but attentive user and viewer discretion is needed to make sure that whatever setup you make, whether I show it to you or anybody else, I'm comfortable working with it. It doesn't mean you are. Don't do anything you're not comfortable with or that you feel is not safe. Just completely disregard it. You're far better off abandoning any aspirations for woodworking than you are cutting off a finger, believe me. So work safe, use your head. Now I'll show the whole process of setting up the next leg in the fixture and making the cut. I've pre-marked these pieces, deciding where's the optimum place to put the scarf cut, which will be at the top of the trellis. With the piece firmly clamped into place and the long end of the workpiece supported on the roller stand, I'm good to make the cut. Fire in the hole. Pretty much nothing to it. With a well thought out setup, I can easily replicate the cut quickly, accurately, and safely. If I was making 100 of these cuts, I might optimize the setup a little bit, maybe put a stop block in here, but otherwise it's a good sound setup for making these 3 cuts. And granted, this cut could be made with a skill saw with a little bit of care and do some planing, but anytime I can make a quick but safe and sturdy fixture for a table saw to make repeated cuts, I'll go with that option. There's not a lot of time and virtually no money tied up in making that fixture, but there's no way I'm going to compromise the safety of the rest of my fingers by doing something cheesy here, because there's no cut in the world that's worth that. But in most cases, just like this, you can make a quick fixture. The fixture doesn't have to be adjustable for cutting different angles or anything. I'm making 3 cuts, and so I can just make a quick, easy to put together, easy to take apart fixture with reusable components if I need to make a different cut. And cuts that are near perfect like these really make the assembly process for the rest of the trellis more efficient. So the time spent in making and using a fixture is well spent. I made a simple support block. This piece is cut at 10 degrees that holds the leg in its orientation for drilling the pilot holes that are going to attach these legs to the finial. I'll drill a shallow counter bore for each of the Torx head screws that are going to hold these legs on. I'm using a spade bit because it leaves a nice centered hole I can follow through with the clearance bit that'll go the rest of the way through the legs. A 7/32 inch bit is going to be a nice clearance hole for the shank of the screw. I set the stop so it doesn't drill too far into my table. And I've used a standard drill bit for this operation because it'll easily index itself in the hole from the tip of the spade bit. If I was to use a brad point bit here, it'd be harder to line the two holes up. Nice, clean holes drilled perpendicular to the mating surface will lock the legs to the finial nice and solid. And the pilot holes keep this thin upper leg from splitting now or in the future. After putting layout marks on the three faces of the finial that get legs, I just clamp the leg in place, centered up side to side, and on an index mark to place the leg down from the shoulder. And I use an extended length bit of a good size for the shank diameter. And a couple quick pilot holes so the legs don't split. Perfect, extremely solid and durable connection, just like that. It's a little trickier to clamp and line up the second leg, but I flipped this first leg in the vise to get a better angle. Lined up all the marks. And I guess that's a sign of accurate work. This screw actually lined up so perfectly that the tip of this screw hit the tip of the other screw inside the piece. And the snapping sound is those screw threads meshing on the inside of the finial. To be able to clamp it on, and then I reduce the length of both the screws so they're not all jamming up in the middle. I'll switch the other ones out so I got nice secure anchors that aren't conflicting with each other in the middle. When I took on the project to design and build this trellis/obelisk, I underestimated two things. The first was the amount of complexity I introduced into the project by building it on a triangular footprint rather than a rectangular one. The second thing I underestimated was the difficulty of doing a video on a project with that level of complexity in the millwork and joinery. My underestimation of the video part didn't come till the end after I'd already shot all the video of making all the various parts. Then I had to backpedal to separate the build into three segments and produce three separate videos. So I'm using this little video clip segment as a segue for anything that I missed in the production process that I have to patch up now that I'm producing the videos. I laid out a circle of the right diameter for this trellis on a piece of scrap melamine and then divided it into three 120-degree pie segments to locate the final position for these legs. I made some quick stop blocks that orient the legs in the right position so that the lattice work will fit like it's supposed to.